Welcome back to another 100-day project Wednesday. Number 57 of my 100 collage papers is a quick and simple fun way to add my type of not too distinct text to a collage piece. I have had the question if there is a non-shiny alternative to the packing tape image transfer, and although this is a little different, it is useful. I would like to try white medical tape, but this would also look interesting. I might want to blend it in with its surroundings a little bit with some paint so it looks a little less like masking tape. It doesn't really work for magazine images, at least not with the magazines I tried, but you can lift some text from the shinier pages. You may have noticed that my first piece of tape did not pull up much text. It does need to be rubbed down very well. The day after trying to see what I could do with masking tape and book and magazine text, I tried out a new toy, or tool, I suppose. Silicone mats as a less expensive alternative to the gel plate. First off, just getting a feel for just a colorful layer of paint monoprint pull. If you've been around a while, it won't surprise you to see that I started with phthalo blue. I'm not really trying to spread out the paint much. I didn't notice how the brayer is difficult on the surface. I'll find that out later. And again, no surprise, quinacridone magenta. Spread it around a bit, although I assumed it would work to pull acrylic paint from the surface of the silicone mat. Since I hadn't tried it yet, I didn't really go for any particular effect except color. You can see that I'm struggling with the brayer. I was wondering if it was because it was new, and this particular one does seem to have a bit of a curve, so the center doesn't touch as closely as the edges. However, I have found it is more an issue with the silicone mat than the brayers. As predicted, you can pull a layer of wet paint from the surface of the silicone mat, but it also left a lot of paint on the silicone mat. Another thing you'll be familiar with if you've been around a while is that I'm sometimes known to use too much paint. One thing that it's easier to notice here and at double speed is how the paint separates on the silicone mat. Not that it doesn't on the gel plate, but with this depth of paint, you don't see the same separation. This looked like it might be a good amount of paint for an image transfer, so I had to give it a try. I did get back to it in more depth the next day. I used a piece of cardstock to keep from getting the paint from around the image everywhere, and found that an image would transfer from a magazine page to the silicone. Did a straight pull onto cardstock, and not an ideal result, but it did prove that it can be done, and I'll work on it. But for now, back to just color with quinacridone magenta, cadmium yellow medium hue, and copper. Yes, the paint is a little too thick, and I want to try to maintain my copper, so I don't want to get the quinacridone magenta and yellow into it too much. Rolling off the brayer that is sliding through the color more than rolling. But onward with my copper, my favorite metallic. These paints are all, as usual, Liquitex Basics. I do a few other types, but yes, predominantly Liquitex Basics. They are inexpensive and I like the quality. You can find a link in the description to Blick Art Materials, which is where I usually purchase them. They're cheaper than on Amazon, but if you have Amazon Prime, there's the whole minimum amount for free shipping, so there's that. Laying down a sheet of cardstock for the pull. As this is not multiple layer, I am not rubbing it down as hard. I can see that it's not pulling up the paint though, so I'm rubbing a little harder. And I think the roll-off sheet looks pretty cool. I love how the copper gives it a glow, as well as the gorgeous color. And as far as the second paint pull test, I left it to dry, unlike the first. I thought it was pretty dry, and the pull started relatively well, but then I hit a wet patch, and yes, it was leaving a lot of the paint on the silicone mat. So I guess it takes longer to dry. And it was back to image transfer on the silicone mat for Collage Paper 56. My beloved Payne's Gray to start, and a high contrast image, I believe from a Harper's Bazaar. If not, it was Town and Country. Brayering the paint into a very thin layer. Struggling with the brayer a bit still, but it does work better the thinner the paint is. And it also no longer being completely brand new seems to also make a difference. Apply the image face down and make sure it is well rubbed down onto the surface and the paint on the surface. I'm not really sure where this one went wrong, but it did not pull well even though I let it sit for a bit, and maybe that was the issue. Decided to try to pull the image with a sheet of cardstock because sometimes what I can see isn't what's actually on the plate, or in this case matte, but there was not enough wet paint for the paper to pick up. Although it did not look at all promising, I did decide to try to pull what was there with a layer of paint. I started with bronze because I like to use my metallics to give it a glow, but bronze is my least favorite. It was just what was handiest, and it looks not awesome, and the brayer is not helping. Try to thin it down so it would just be a glow, not a brownish cast to everything. Went with light colors. Long story short, this just ended up a mess. But as it was probably mostly user error, I did try again with another high contrast image. Again, I believe it was Harper's Bazaar. It could have been Town and Country. Started with the thin layer of Payne's Gray. I did leave the excess paint dried on around the edges. Struggling to get my Payne's Gray spread evenly and thinly enough. So as I have previously mentioned, when you get to a certain point, you start pulling paint back off, and in this context, that can be very helpful. So yes, clean off the brayer and pull off some more paint. This is looking like it is a promising, very thin layer of paint. So apply the image, rub it on well. I used an excess sheet in order to use the brayer. This step we do not allow to dry. It came out awesome. I do want to pull this with paint instead of trying to just pull the image on plain paper because I'm afraid there's not enough wet paint left for a clear pull. But before I added the pull layer, I did have to make sure the image layer was completely dry. I went with Liquitex Basics Light Blue Violet and Titanium White. And the light blue violet was darker and more opaque than I expected it to be. Again, struggling with both the brayer and the thickness of the paint. I got it spread pretty smooth and was hoping it wasn't too thick. Or given the fact I could see here, not too thin either, it did end up leaning more toward too thick. But I found that out after I applied the cardstock and let it thoroughly dry. That was me testing to see if it still felt that coolness of wet, damp. As I sort of feared, the light blue violet did overpower the image a bit, but it still looks pretty good, and I like the look of the old excess dry paint that it also pulled up from the mat. Collage paper number 57 continued with the silicone mat with baby powder resist because that should work great with the silicone mat, not just the gel plate. And yes, you may have noticed that I said should. I decided to start with just a plain silver layer so that any of the areas that were masked all the way down to the paper had the silver shimmer instead of just paper. Continuing to struggle with the brayer on the silicone mat, but made it to a decent thin layer and pulled it with a sheet of cardstock. And this is certainly sufficient for a base layer. I next went with a layer of cadmium yellow medium hue, but that was because I couldn't find my brilliant yellow green. I shook on some baby powder as I did in the gel plate baby powder resist videos. Put down my cardstock, rubbed it down well, and that is not the greatest result, in large part because of the way the brayer interacts with the paint on the silicone. Went ahead and added a second layer, this time in phthalo blue. Adding another layer on top of the remaining paint and baby powder was how I did it in my previous altered book page baby powder resist video. And as I went, I did wonder if the more textured and porous surface of the old book pages I was using would work better for this process on the silicone mat. These are coming out interesting, but the baby powder in a lot of the page is almost superfluous. Most of the texture is being created by the brayer. So it's interesting, but it's not the look baby powder resist has when the paint is spread smoothly. This was a final layer with quinacridone magenta. As I said, it is an interesting look. And the grungy look can be cool, but the lines throw things off. Overall, I'm not thrilled. I think it's interesting, but it's not what I was going for. I did decide that the colors on the mat were pretty and I would pull them with matte medium. Again, on cardstock. You can see with what I clean off the brayer what I mentioned before about the matte and gloss mediums reactivating the paint, making it wet again. I like how this looks. Multi-layer pulls do need to dry completely. You can see the glossy sheen from the medium, and I do like how this came out better than I like the print it is left over from. I also prefer the roll-off sheet to the original. I did try again, and it was frustrating. It did not work the way it was supposed to work. But yes, still trying. I remembered I got a Baron as well as mats. I tried a paintbrush instead of the roller, but the results were never quite what I hoped. That had some extra paint I thought looked cool, so I tried to pull it off gently. And yeah, I kept going. And it is interesting, and it is more like what I would expect it to be. Second pull on that, pull with medium for this one. So all paint from the same piece. Added purple, yeah, that didn't go well. It was slippery than I expected it to be. Neither the first nor the last time I slid things off. With as little success as I was having, I did decide to go back to the book pages and did find that they seemed to work well. I also noticed that with the second pull of these with the magenta, I let them sit for a little bit. So I tried that for another layer, an orangey layer from the yellow and magenta, and did see an improved effect. For Collage Paper 58, I decided to do the water separation thing because, hey, paint already separates on the silicone mat, and I even used the thinner craft paint. It's supposed to separate when the water breaks the surface tension and as it dries. Nope. So I decided to just play with paint because I needed some raspberry and purple for a jewelry order. Random mark making tools from around the house and alcohol. I can't say that I was loving how it was all looking as I went. There's some acrylic ink, but I was just playing and it felt good and it was relaxing. You may have noticed I was using my small gel plate for my palette, so I'd have something interesting to pull at the end. And with the alcohol that had gotten mixed in with the paint as I went, yes, that's looking pretty interesting. I used a layer of matte medium to pull it. And here's a peek at some more of my raspberry purple play. After my colorful break from the silicone mat, I was ready to come back to try again for Collage Paper 59, working with what I've learned of the mat so far and of what I've seen of fluid acrylics on the gel plate, to go for a crackly, sort of shattered layer look over color. I didn't want my separated areas to only be along the lines of the brayer, so that was a struggle. and that was fun to watch separate, but it's way too thick. But I had taken what was still in my brayer and put it down on another silicone mat, and it did separate, but with the thinner paint, it did have a smaller lace pattern. I allowed it to thoroughly dry so it could be pulled up with paint. I had found my brilliant yellow green, so I started with that, along with cadmium yellow light hue, light pink, and a bit of quinacridone magenta to make the pink more vivid. Got out the big brayer. Ended up having to add some more green and yellow cardstock. And as this is a layered pull, it needs to sit and dry thoroughly. I think this came out pretty well, but I also know it can be done a little more dramatically. So the next day, for collage paper number 60, I brought back the page that had been too paint covered from the day before, as well as the Mars Black fluid acrylic. I revisited the water thing, figuring that would be enough to help the paint separate, but I was wrong. I also had paint left on the brayer, so got out another mat. It wasn't quite enough, so added some more, less than the one next to it, of course. And this is more of the effect I was looking for. I thought maybe writing through the thicker paint could help the separation. I probably should have tried it sooner, though I don't know how much of an effect it would have given how little it did. These needed to dry thoroughly before I could add a layer of paint. This still had some water drops on it, and I noticed when I touched one, it did make the paint separate a bit, but trying to poke the rest of them didn't accomplish much. I decided to go shiny for my pull layer with Liquitex Basics Copper, as well as Gloss Medium. Same drill, brayer, cardstock, apply it really well, roll-off sheet that applies pressure and gives me something else. The copper didn't show up much on the other, and the results. That has some interesting spots, and yeah, this is more the effect that I was going for, and shiny. Give me a thumbs up if this video has you feeling creative. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll be back next week with another 7 collage papers, as well as my daily short and Sunday art prompt.